The San Francisco Conference Center buzzed like a beehive on a warm summer afternoon. People in sharp suits and designer dresses moved through the grand hall, their voices overlapping in a symphony of networking, laughter, business cards being exchanged, promises of, "Let's connect soon," floating through the air like confetti. At the center of it all stood Victoria Langston, CEO of Langston Capital, still basking in the afterglow of her keynote speech titled, "Inclusive Innovation Building Tomorrow's Tech." Together, she'd just stepped off the stage to polite applause and a few genuine nods of approval. Her talk had been polished, confident, full of the right buzzwords: diversity, equity, access, opportunity. She'd even shared a personal anecdote about mentoring a young woman from a rural community who'd gone on to launch a successful edtech startup. The audience ate it up. Now standing near a sleek display of sustainable coffee cups and branded tote bags, Victoria adjusted the lapel of her tailored blazer and scanned the crowd. Her mind wasn't on the speech anymore. It was already racing ahead to the next move. Who could she talk to? Who mattered? She spotted the founder of a buzzy AI health startup across the room and started weaving through the crowd, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. But before she could reach him, someone stepped into her path. He was a black man, probably in his late 40s, dressed simply but neatly. A dark navy button-down shirt. No tie, dark slacks, and clean but unassuming shoes. He wasn't flashy. He didn't carry a stack of business cards or wear a smartwatch that blinked with notifications. But there was something calm in his posture, a quiet steadiness in his eyes as he offered a small, polite smile. Without a word, he extended his hand. Victoria hesitated. It wasn't a long pause, maybe half a second, but it was enough. In that sliver of time, her brain did what it had been trained to do over years of high-stakes deal-making. It assessed. Was he someone? Did he have funding? A big title? A recognizable logo on his lanyard? His badge simply read guest, no company name, no title, nothing that screamed opportunity. And in that instant, an old, unspoken reflex kicked in, one she'd never admitted to herself, let alone discussed in any of her DEI panels. "Oh," she said, her voice bright but tight, pulling her hand back slightly. "I'm so sorry, I actually have a bit of a skin sensitivity right now. Handshakes can be tricky." She gave a little laugh, the kind meant to smooth things over, and offered a quick, shallow nod instead. "But it was great to meet you." The man didn't flinch. He didn't frown or look hurt. He simply lowered his hand, nodded back just as politely, and said, "Of course. No problem at all." His voice was calm, measured. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the flow of people near the refreshment table. Victoria barely registered his departure. She was already scanning again, spotting the AI health founder waving at her from across the room. She hurried over, her earlier interaction already fading like a background noise she'd learned to ignore. But the man remembered. He'd seen that look before. The flicker of hesitation, the too quick excuse, the way her eyes had darted past him as if he were a piece of furniture blocking the path. He'd spent decades in boardrooms, labs, and investor meetings where his presence was often met with surprise, skepticism, or outright dismissal. Despite his credentials, despite his track record, he'd learned not to take it personally, not in the moment. Anger wouldn't get him a seat at the table. But disappointment? That lingered. He walked over to the coffee station, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and leaned against the wall, watching the room. He wasn't here to pitch, not today. He was here because he believed in the mission of the conference, to bring together people who could shape a more ethical, human-centered tech future. He'd spoken at last year's event, actually, though few remembered. His talk had been technical, focused on algorithmic fairness in hiring software. It hadn't gone viral. There were no standing ovations. But a few people had stayed afterward to ask thoughtful questions. That was enough for him. Now, watching Victoria laugh easily with a group of well-dressed men, he wondered if any of her inclusive innovation talk was more than just words. He'd read her firm's portfolio, mostly flashy consumer apps, crypto-adjacent ventures, and one or two diversity-washed startups that checked boxes but lacked real impact. He knew the game. He'd played it himself once. But somewhere along the way, he'd decided that if he was going to build something, it had to mean something. He took a slow sip of coffee. The bitterness grounded him. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of having to prove his worth before even saying hello. Tired of watching people like Victoria, smart, capable, influential, talk about equity while their actions whispered something else entirely. Back across the room, Victoria was deep in conversation, her energy high, her gestures animated. She mentioned her firm's new impact fund designed to support underrepresented founders. One of the men nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what the ecosystem needs," he said. "People like you leading the charge." She smiled, accepting the praise. It felt good. Right even. She truly believed she was making a difference. She hired diverse interns. She sat on advisory boards for women in tech. She'd even donated to a coding camp in Oakland. Wasn't that enough? What she didn't realize was that inclusion wasn't just about programs or donations. It was about the small moments, the unguarded seconds when no one was watching, when instinct took over. Like refusing a handshake from a man who didn't look like a founder, didn't sound like an investor, didn't fit the mental image she'd built over years of Silicon Valley norms. The man finished his coffee, set the cup down gently on a nearby tray, and straightened his shirt. He wasn't here to confront her. Not today. But he made a mental note. If their paths crossed again, and in this small interconnected world of tech they often did, he'd be ready. Not for revenge, but for truth. As the afternoon wore on, the conference buzz began to wind down. Attendees gathered their things, snapped final photos, and exchanged last-minute contact info. Victoria, satisfied with her networking haul, headed toward the exit, already drafting an email in her head about a potential partnership. She didn't see the man again. He'd left quietly without fanfare, but his presence lingered in the room like a quiet question, one she hadn't even known to ask. Later that evening, back in her hotel suite overlooking the bay, Victoria scrolled through her notes from the day. She jotted down names, follow-ups, potential leads. She felt accomplished, productive. She even posted a photo on LinkedIn, her on stage, mic in hand, captioned, "Grateful to share the vision of inclusive innovation with such inspiring leaders today. The future is built together. We're tech for good, diversity in tech." The post got dozens of likes within minutes. Comments poured in. "You killed it, Victoria. So proud of the work you're doing. This is why you're a role model." She smiled, closed her laptop, and poured herself a glass of wine. The city lights shimmered below, beautiful and distant. She had no idea that the man whose hand she'd refused was, at that very moment, reviewing a confidential document that could change the fate of her company, and that in a few days, she'd be sitting across from him in a sleek conference room, heart pounding, realizing that the guest with no title had more power and more principle than she'd ever imagined. But for now, the night was calm. The wine was good, and the world, as far as she knew, was exactly as she'd always believed it to be, a place where effort, charm, and the right connections were enough to succeed. She didn't know that sometimes the most important moments aren't the ones on stage, but the quiet ones off to the side, where a simple handshake becomes a mirror, and mirrors, as she would soon learn, don't lie. A few days after the conference, the rhythm of the office settled back into its usual pace. Emails piling up, meetings stacking like dominoes, the low hum of ambition filling every corner of Langston Capital's downtown headquarters. Victoria sat at her glass desk, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, reviewing a pitch deck from a promising climate tech startup. Her assistant, a sharp young woman who'd been with her for 3 years, knocked lightly on the open door. "Got a request you might want to see," she said, holding out a tablet. "Someone named Wright wants a meeting. Says he's the founder of Veritas Labs." Victoria barely looked up. "Wright, from where?" "Didn't say, but he mentioned he was at the Innovate Forward conference last week. Said he heard your talk and wanted to connect." That caught her attention. She set the tablet down and finally looked at her assistant. "Did he give any details about his company?" "Just that it's in AI ethics. Something about bias detection in hiring and lending algorithms." "Oh, and he said he's been operating quietly for the past 2 years, but they've already got contracts with 3 federal agencies and 2 major banks." Victoria raised an eyebrow. That was unusual. Most early-stage founders came begging for attention. This one sounded measured, confident but not loud. She scrolled through the brief profile her assistant had pulled together. No flashy LinkedIn photo, no list of past exits. Just a clean, minimalist website with white text on a dark background and a single sentence. Building technology that sees people, not patterns. Something about it felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. Still, federal contracts, big banks, that was serious traction. And in the AI ethics space, a field suddenly exploding, with interest after a string of scandals. Involving discriminatory algorithms, this could be exactly the kind of investment that would boost Langston Capital's credibility, especially after her inclusive innovation speech. Investors were watching. The press was watching. She needed wins that aligned with her message. Set up a meeting, she said. Next week, 1 hour. Bring in Daniel and Priya. They've been pushing for us to get into responsible AI. Her assistant nodded and left. Victoria leaned back in her chair, already imagining the press release. Langston Capital backs groundbreaking AI ethics startup. It would look good. It would feel good. And maybe, just maybe, it would prove, to herself as much as anyone, that she was walking the talk. She didn't think about the man from the conference. Not really. There had been hundreds of people there, dozens of handshakes or near handshakes. It was just one moment in a sea of interactions. She certainly didn't connect the quiet guest with this mysterious founder. After all, real founders didn't wear plain shirts and stand by the coffee table. Real founders had logos, teams, hype, but life has a way of circling back. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 a.m. in the firm's main conference room, the one with the panoramic view of the city skyline and the state-of-the-art video wall. Victoria arrived 5 minutes early, as always, and smoothed her blazer. Daniel and Priya were already there, laptops open, coffee in hand. Priya, the firm's head of emerging tech, had done some digging. Veritas Labs is low profile, but their tech is legit, she said. They've built a real-time auditing system that flags bias in machine learning models before they go live. Not just race or gender, things like zip code, education history, even word choice in resumes. And they don't just point out problems, they suggest fixes. It's actually kind of brilliant, Daniel, the COO, added. Their client list is sealed under NDA, but I heard through a contact at the Treasury Department that they helped overhaul the loan approval system for a major national bank. Reduce false rejections by 38% in minority neighborhoods. Without lowering standards, Victoria nodded, impressed. All right, let's keep an open mind. If the numbers check out, this could be our entry into ethical AI. At exactly 10 a.m., the receptionist buzzed in. Mr. Wright is here. Victoria stood, ready to greet him with the warm, professional handshake she reserved for serious prospects. And then he walked in. The same man. The same calm eyes. The same quiet presence. Her stomach dropped like a stone. For a split second, time seemed to stop. She saw it all flash back. The conference hall, the extended hand, her flimsy excuse about skin sensitivity. The way she'd brushed him off like he was nothing. And now here he was. Not as a nameless guest, but as the founder of a company that could be worth millions, maybe more. She forced a smile, hoping her face didn't betray the panic rising in her chest. Mr. Wright? So glad you could make it, he nodded, calm as ever. Thank you for having me. He didn't offer his hand this time. Neither did she. The unspoken moment hung between them like a ghost. They sat. He opened his laptop, connected it to the display with a simple cable, no fancy dongles, no fuss, and began his presentation. His voice was steady, clear, free of the usual startup bravado. He didn't say disrupt or unicorn or change the world. He talked about real problems. How an algorithm trained on biased historical data could deny someone a loan simply because they lived in the wrong neighborhood. How hiring tools could filter out qualified candidates because their resumes didn't match the pattern of past hires. Patterns shaped by decades of exclusion. He showed live demos. One screen displayed a mock hiring platform. As fake resumes scrolled by, his software highlighted subtle red flags. Candidate from historically black university. System. Downgrades due to lack of prestige. Correlation. Another showed a loan application being denied because the applicant used words like community or support, terms more common in certain demographics, flagged as less financially literate by the model. This isn't about blame, he said, looking directly at Victoria. It's about awareness. Most companies don't realize their AI is making these calls. They trust the tech. But trust without verification is just negligence. Victoria found herself leaning forward, genuinely captivated. This wasn't theory. It was actionable, practical, and deeply human. Halfway through the presentation, he paused. "I was at the Innovate Forward conference last week," he said casually, as if mentioning the weather. "Heard your talk on inclusive innovation. It was thoughtful." Victoria's throat went dry. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you," she finally managed. "I meant every word." He held her gaze for just a beat longer than necessary. Then he smiled slightly, not unkindly but with a quiet knowing, and moved on to the next slide. The rest of the pitch was flawless. He outlined Veritas Labs' business model, subscription-based software for enterprises with a non-profit arm that offered free tools to small businesses and non-profits. He shared growth metrics, modest but steady, no hype, no burn rate insanity. He talked about his team, engineers, ethicists, sociologists, even a former civil rights lawyer. "We don't just build code," he said. "We build context." By the end of the hour, Daniel and Priya were visibly impressed. "This is exactly what the market needs," Priya said. "And your go-to-market strategy is refreshingly sane." Daniel added, "We'd need to run due diligence, of course. But on first look, this is compelling," Victoria agreed, out loud. But inside her mind was racing, not just about the investment potential, but about that moment at the conference. Had he noticed her hesitation? Of course he had. Had he come here to call her out? To embarrass her? He hadn't said a word about it. But the fact that he'd mentioned the conference, that felt intentional. As they wrapped up, she stood again. "We'll be in touch soon," she said, trying to sound confident. This was incredibly valuable. He packed his laptop slowly, deliberately. "I appreciate your time," he said. Then just before he left, he turned back. "By the way, no hard feelings about the handshake. I know how these things go." And then he was gone. The room felt suddenly colder. Daniel and Priya exchanged glances. "What was that about?" Priya asked. Victoria forced a laugh. "Oh, nothing, just conference chaos. You know how it is," but she knew, and she suspected he knew she knew. The moment the door closed, she sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. She replayed the meeting in her head, the precision of his words, the quiet authority in his voice, the way he'd looked at her when he mentioned the conference. This wasn't just another founder. This was someone who understood power, perception, and the weight of small choices. She needed to know more. Not just about his company, but about him. "Daniel," she said, voice steady despite the storm inside. "Run a deep background check, everything. Education, past roles, patents, funding history, and see if you can find out who's backing him." Daniel nodded. "On it?" As he left, Victoria stared out the window at the city below. For the first time in years, she felt exposed. Not because she'd made a business mistake, but because she'd revealed something about herself she didn't even know was visible. And now the man who'd seen it was standing right in the middle of her professional world. She took a deep breath. Whatever came next, she couldn't fake her way through it. Not with him. Because some people don't just build technology. They see through it. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of emails, calls, and restless nights. Victoria tried to focus on other deals, reviewing term sheets, joining Zoom calls with founders in Europe, even approving a new office plant for the lobby, but her mind kept circling back to the meeting. To him. To that quiet, knowing look when he'd mentioned the conference. She told herself it was just nerves. Every investor felt pressure when a promising deal landed on their desk. But this was different. This felt personal. On Thursday morning, Daniel walked into her office without knocking, something he only did when it was urgent. He held a slim folder, the kind used for high-priority internal memos. His face was unreadable. "You asked for a full background on Wright," he said, placing the folder on her desk. "I think you should read this before we decide anything." Victoria's pulse quickened. She opened the folder. The first page was a standard professional summary. Education, PhD in computer science from a top-tier university. Former roles: lead researcher at a major tech lab, then chief ethics officer at one of the world's largest social media companies during its most turbulent years. That alone was impressive. Those roles were rare, high-stakes positions usually held by people with decades of policy experience. But it was the next few pages that made her blood run cold. Beneath a section labeled Investor Activity, Confidential Sources, there was a single line. Anonymous angel investor in Langston Capital Series B Bridge Round, 3/2022. Victoria stared at the words, her breath caught. That bridge round had saved her company. It had been a brutal year. A major portfolio company had collapsed. 2 limited partners pulled out last minute. The firm was weeks away from missing payroll. She'd been working 18-hour days, fielding panicked calls from her board trying to keep the ship from sinking. Then out of nowhere, an anonymous investor wired $4.2 million. No questions asked, no board seat requested, just clean, quiet capital with one condition. Keep your team intact. People matter more than exits. She'd never found out who it was. She'd assumed it was a wealthy alum from her MBA program, or maybe a former client who believed in her vision. She'd even sent a heartfelt generic thank you note to a list of possible suspects, but no one ever claimed it. Now she knew. Her hands trembled as she flipped to the next page. There, in clear black and white, was a scanned copy of an internal memo from her own firm, dated just 6 months ago. It was the draft of a DEI audit commissioned after a junior analyst raised concerns about biased language in their investment memos. The audit had been thorough, uncomfortable, and damning. It pointed out patterns, how pitches from Black and Latino founders were more likely to be labeled risky or unproven, while similar ideas from white founders were called bold or visionary. How the firm's network-based sourcing strategy quietly excluded entire communities. The report had been buried, not officially, of course. But after one tense partner meeting, it was decided the findings were preliminary and not actionable at this time. The document was archived, access restricted, and the conversation quietly dropped. Victoria had told herself it was because they needed more data. But deep down, she knew it was because the truth was inconvenient. And now, at the bottom of the page in small print, was the auditor's name. Veritas Labs, lead consultant, Wright. She leaned back in her chair, stunned. It wasn't just that he'd invested in her company. It wasn't just that he'd built a groundbreaking tech firm. He'd also been the one to hold up a mirror to her firm's hypocrisy, and she'd chosen to look away. Worse, she realized with a sinking feeling, he must have known all along who she was when they met at the conference. He'd heard her speak about inclusion. He'd seen her firm's public statements, and then he'd watched her refuse to shake his hand, because he didn't fit the image of someone important. The irony was crushing. She closed the folder slowly, her mind racing. What did he want? Was this a test, a trap, or was he simply presenting an opportunity and letting her decide what kind of leader she really was? She called Daniel back in. Did he know? When he came in, did he know about the audit? About the investment? Daniel hesitated. I can't say for sure, but his firm was hired under a blind contract. We never told them who the client was. Standard practice for sensitive audits. So unless someone leaked it, which I doubt, he shouldn't have known it was us. Victoria frowned. Then how? Maybe he didn't, Daniel said gently. Maybe he just recognized the patterns. His whole business is about seeing what others miss. She nodded slowly. That made sense. And it made it even more unsettling. He hadn't come in with a grudge. He hadn't name-dropped his past role or hinted at his secret investment. He'd just shown up, presented his work, and let the truth speak for itself. Later that afternoon, alone in her office, Victoria pulled up the Veritas Labs website again. This time she read every word. She clicked on the Our Team page, still sparse, but now she noticed the small bios. One mentioned a former government advisor on algorithmic accountability. Another cited work with the UN on digital rights. And in the About section, a quote stood out. Technology doesn't create bias, people do. But technology can help us see it and choose differently. She sat there for a long time, staring at that sentence. It felt like it was written just for her. That evening, instead of heading home, she stayed late. She dug up the archived DEI audit, the one she'd avoided reading in full. Page by page, she forced herself to confront it. The data was clear. The examples were specific, and in several cases, her own notes on pitch decks were quoted. Needs more traction, unclear path to scale, founder seems inexperienced. Meanwhile, Nearly identical comments from white male founders had been followed by high potential, strong narrative, willing to take big swings. She felt a flush of shame. Not because she was a bad person, she truly believed in fairness, but because she'd let her instincts override her values. And because she'd built a public persona around inclusion, while privately making choices that contradicted it. The next morning, she called a meeting with her leadership team. Not about Veritas Labs, not about investments, but about the audit. I want us to reopen this, she said, placing the printed report on the table, not as a compliance exercise, as a real reckoning. We're going to share the findings with the whole firm. We're going to revise our evaluation criteria, and we're going to start tracking our decisions by founder demographics, not to check a box, but to hold ourselves accountable. Her partners were surprised, but no one argued. They'd seen the writing on the wall. The industry was changing. Investors were demanding transparency, and honestly, some of them had been waiting for her to take this step. But Victoria knew this wasn't just about business strategy anymore. It was about integrity. She also made another decision. She would reach out to Wright, not as an investor chasing a deal, but as a person seeking clarity. She drafted an email 3 times before she got it right. No fluff, no excuses, just honesty. Thank you again for your time and your powerful presentation. After reviewing your work and reflecting on our own practices, I'd appreciate the chance to speak with you again off the record. Not about funding, just about how we move forward with real accountability. If you're open to it, I'd be grateful. She hit send before she could overthink it. 2 hours later, a reply came. Short, direct. I'm available Friday at 3 p.m., my office. Come alone, her heart pounded. She didn't know what to expect. Forgiveness? A lecture? A flat no. But she knew one thing. She couldn't pretend anymore. The handshake had been a small thing, but small things reveal big truths, and now she had to face the man who'd seen hers. As she prepared for Friday, she didn't rehearse talking points or craft a pitch. She simply asked herself one question: who do I want to be? Not on stage, but in the quiet moments when no one's watching. The answer, she realized, was still being written, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to write it honestly. Friday afternoon arrived with a soft rain tapping against the windows of downtown San Francisco. Victoria stood outside a modest brick building in the Mission District, far from the glass towers of the financial district. There were no logos, no sleek signage, just a small brass plaque by the door that read Veritas Labs in simple, understated lettering. She checked her watch. 2:58 p.m. She took a deep breath, smoothed her coat, and stepped inside. The lobby was quiet, warm, and unpretentious. A few potted plants lined the walls, and soft instrumental music played from hidden speakers. A young woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. You must be here to see him. He's expecting you. 3rd floor, last door on the left. Victoria nodded and took the stairs. No elevator, no corporate grandeur. Each step felt heavier than the last. She wasn't just walking into a meeting. She was walking into a reckoning. When she reached the 3rd floor, she found the door slightly ajar. She knocked gently. Come in, came a calm voice from inside. She stepped into a sunlit room with bookshelves lining 2 walls, a large wooden desk and a small seating area with 2 armchairs and a low table. He was standing by the window looking out at the rain-slicked street below. He turned as she entered, his expression neutral but not unkind. Thanks for coming, he said. Thank you for seeing me, she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. He gestured to one of the chairs. Please sit, she did. He took the other, folding his hands in his lap. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the gentle patter of rain against the glass. Then she said it, plain and direct, the way she'd practiced in her head a dozen times but never quite believed she'd have the courage to say out loud. I owe you an apology. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. At the conference, when you offered your hand and I made up that excuse about skin sensitivity, I wasn't being honest. I was uncomfortable. Not because of you, but because of my own assumptions. I saw you, and without even thinking, I decided you weren't someone worth my time. And that was wrong. Deeply wrong, she paused, swallowing hard. I've spent years talking about inclusion, building a brand around it, even believing I was doing good work. But in that moment, I showed you exactly who I really am when I'm not performing. And I'm ashamed of that. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I finally saw it," she said. "Not just the handshake, but everything behind it. The way my firm evaluates founders. The way I move through rooms like that conference, scanning for value instead of seeing people. You didn't just build a company that detects bias in algorithms. You helped me see the bias in myself." He nodded slowly. "Most people don't want to see that. They'd rather argue, defend, or pretend it wasn't there." "I almost did," she admitted. "For 2 days I told myself it was nothing. Just a missed handshake. But then I realized, if I can dismiss someone in a second based on how they look, what else am I missing? What opportunities am I ignoring? What harm am I causing without even knowing it?" He leaned forward slightly. "You know, I've been in this field for over 20 years. I've sat across from hundreds of investors, executives, policymakers. Most of them want the tech, the tool that makes them look good, that checks a box that says we're ethical. But very few want the truth. Because the truth requires change, and change is uncomfortable. I'm ready to be uncomfortable," she said quietly. He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her words against something deeper, her posture, her eyes, the silence between sentences. Then he said, "I'm not going to take your investment." Her heart sank, but she didn't argue. She just nodded. "I understand." "It's not about the money," he continued. "It's about trust. You can't build ethical technology with partners who only care about ethics when it's convenient. And right now, I don't trust that your firm's commitment is real. Not yet. Not after what I saw and not after what your own audit revealed." She didn't look away. "You're right. But," he said, and there was a shift in his tone. Softer, but firmer. "That doesn't mean this ends here." He stood and walked over to his desk, returning with a single sheet of paper. He handed it to her. It was a 1-page proposal for a nonprofit initiative called Open Path. The goal was simple: provide free access to Veritas Labs' bias detection tools for small businesses, community colleges, and grassroots organizations that couldn't afford enterprise software. But it needed support, not just funding but visibility. Mentors, advocates, partners who would champion it publicly, not just write a check and walk away. "This is where real change starts," he said. "Not in boardrooms, but in classrooms, in local hiring offices, in neighborhood banks. If you're serious about inclusion, this is your chance to prove it. Not by investing in me, but by lifting others up." She read the page carefully, her fingers tracing the edges.
"What would you need from me?"
"2 things," he said. "First, commit Langston Capital as a founding partner. Not just a donation, active involvement. Have your team help train users. Share your platform to amplify their stories. Second, speak about it, publicly. Not as a PR move, but as a confession. Tell people what you learned. Tell them about the handshake. Tell them that inclusion isn't a slogan. It's a daily choice, especially when no one's watching." Her breath caught. That would be risky, vulnerable. It could invite criticism, even mockery, but it would also be honest. "I'll do it," she said without hesitation. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. "Don't say it because you think it's what I want to hear. Say it because you mean it." "I mean it," she said. "I've spent so much time trying to look like a good leader that I forgot how to be one. This feels like a chance to start over." He nodded. "Then we'll start here." They talked for another hour, not about deals or valuations, but about people. About the young woman in Detroit who used their tool to prove her loan denial was algorithmic discrimination. About the high school teacher in New Mexico who taught her students to audit AI with free classroom kits. About the quiet, everyday courage it takes to challenge systems that were never built for you. When Victoria finally stood to leave, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long golden streaks across the wet pavement. At the door, he extended his hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. She took it, firm, warm, human. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For not letting me get away with it." He smiled just a little. "Some things are too important to let go." She walked back to her car, the city glistening around her. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel forgiven. But she felt something better, clear. For the first time in years, she knew exactly what she needed to do. Not because it was smart business, but because it was right, and that, she realized, was the only foundation worth building on. 3 months later, the Community Tech Summit was held not in a gleaming convention center, but in a repurposed warehouse on the edge of Oakland. Exposed brick walls, string lights crisscrossing the high ceiling, folding chairs arranged in loose circles rather than rigid rows. There were no velvet ropes, no VIP lounges, no branded swag bags. Just people, teachers, students, small business owners, coders, activists, all gathered under one roof because they believed technology should serve everyone, not just the privileged few. Victoria arrived early, not in a chauffeured car but on the BART train, her coat damp from the morning drizzle. She carried a reusable tote bag with a simple logo, Open Path Initiative. No heels today, just comfortable boots and a sweater. She wasn't here as a keynote speaker. She wasn't even on the official program. She was here to help set up chairs, refill coffee carafes, and listen. As she arranged name tags at the registration table, a few people recognized her. Some looked surprised. Others nodded respectfully. One young woman, barely out of college, approached shyly. "You're the CEO of Langston Capital, right?" she asked. "I am," Victoria said, smiling. "But today I'm just volunteering." The woman hesitated, then said, "I saw your talk last week at the university about the handshake and the audit. It meant a lot. My professor showed it to our ethics class." Victoria felt a lump in her throat. "I'm glad," she said simply. "Thank you for listening." Later that morning, the main session began. Instead of a stage, there was a low platform with 2 armchairs and a small table, just like the one in his office. He walked out first, greeted by warm applause. Then he turned and gestured toward the side entrance. Victoria stepped into the light. A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't the usual power dynamic, a founder pitching to an investor. This was something else entirely. She sat down, hands folded in her lap, looking out at the faces before her. Diverse, curious, hopeful. No cameras flashing, no live stream, just real people in a real room. He began not with questions about funding or growth, but with a simple one. "What changed for you?" She took a breath. "I used to think inclusion was something you did, a program you launched, a quota you hit, a speech you gave. But I've learned it's something you are. It's how you move through the world when no one's watching, and I failed that test." She told the story plainly, the conference, the hesitation, the excuse, the shame that followed. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just named it, like naming a wound so it can heal. "I spent so much time building a reputation as someone who cared about equity that I stopped checking whether my actions matched my words. And that's dangerous, because when you believe your own story too much, you stop seeing the truth." He listened quietly, then asked, "And now?" "Now I'm learning to listen more than I speak," she said. "To question my instincts instead of trusting them. To measure success not by how many deals I close, but by how many voices I help amplify." She talked about the changes at her firm, the new evaluation rubric that removed subjective language like gut feel and cultural fit, the monthly transparency reports showing founder demographics and funding outcomes, the partnership with Open Path, which had already trained over 200 small employers and community colleges in ethical AI use. "But the biggest change," she said, "was realizing that I don't have to be the hero of this story. Real inclusion means stepping back so others can lead." He nodded. "That's the hardest part for people in power, letting go of the narrative." "Yes," she said, "and I'm still learning." After the conversation ended, there was no standing ovation, just quiet applause and thoughtful silence. People lingered, asking questions, sharing their own stories. Victoria stayed for hours talking to a high school student, building a bias detection tool for college admissions, to a nonprofit director who'd used Open Path to challenge a discriminatory hiring algorithm at a local hospital. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low and golden through the warehouse windows, she found him near the back packing up cables. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me a second chance, not to invest, but to grow." He looked at her. "You gave yourself that chance." I just held up the mirror. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching volunteers stack chairs and roll up extension cords. "I heard Veritas Labs turned down 3 acquisition offers last month," she said gently. He smiled. Some things aren't for sale, she understood. His work wasn't about exits or valuations. It was about integrity. And that was priceless. As she walked back to the BART station, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her assistant. Board meeting notes ready. Also, Open Path just got a call from the Department of Labor. They want to pilot our toolkit nationwide. She smiled, but didn't reply right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky, now streaked with pink and orange. The city hummed around her. Buses, bikes, voices in a dozen languages. It felt alive, real. She thought about how different her life felt now. She still ran a firm. She still made tough decisions. But something had shifted inside her. She no longer measured her worth by how many people wanted her time, but by how often she made space for others. A few weeks later, Langston Capital announced it would not be investing in Veritas Labs. The press was surprised. Analysts speculated. But in a short statement, Victoria wrote, "Sometimes the most valuable partnerships aren't financial. They're human, and this one taught us more than any term sheet ever could." There were no grand headlines. No viral moments, just quiet ripples spreading outward, in boardrooms that started asking harder questions, in pitch meetings where potential was redefined, in classrooms where students learned that ethics isn't a sidebar in tech, it's the foundation. Back at the office, Victoria kept a small framed print on her desk. Not a stock certificate or a magazine cover, but a quote from the Open Path website. "The future isn't built by those who see what's possible. It's built by those who see what's wrong and choose to fix it." She read it every morning, not as a reminder of her mistake, but as a compass. Because leadership, she'd learned, isn't about never falling. It's about how you rise and who you lift up with you. And on the days when doubt crept in, when old habits tugged at her, she remembered the weight of that handshake, the one she'd refused, and the one she'd finally accepted, not as a transaction but as a promise to do better, not perfectly but honestly. And in a world full of polished performances, that was the rarest kind of power of all.